Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about what I think genuinely might be the coolest, most bizarre, and maybe my favorite religion slash cult that I have ever heard of, the Nation of Islam. Like, every time I did more research or read something for this video, I just came away more totally amazed. Their beliefs tie in religion, conspiracy theories, UFOs, aliens, Hollow Earth, the devil creating white people who then evolve into gorillas. It's a whole thing, Yakubian apes. We'll get into it. I can't emphasize enough that this is a real religion practiced to this day in multiple states that has been supported to various extents by people such as Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Ice Cube, even Snoop Dogg. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. The first chunk of this video will mainly be focused on the history of the Nation of Islam, and then I'll go into all the wacky beliefs towards the end of the video. So, like, if you're just here for Yakub and all the memes, you can skip ahead. But I must say, you'll be missing out on quite a few murders, the FBI, a human sacrifice, one of its leaders being exposed as a pedo, and a couple police raids. But that's your choice. Anyway, on to the bizarre history of the Nation of Islam. Our story begins in 1930, Detroit, Michigan, with the mysterious Wallace Fard Muhammad. Now, very little is actually known about Fard Muhammad, and what is known is quite spotty. He supposedly used up to 58 different aliases in his life, and there exists very few pictures of the man. In fact, to this day, he is so mysterious that nobody, not even the FBI, knows when he was born or when he died. What we do know, however, is that in 1930, in Detroit, Michigan, there was a door-to-door salesman named Fard Muhammad who claimed to be from the holy city of Mecca, who sold silk to black residents, claiming that it was the very same that was used by their ancestors in the holy city of Mecca. This enticed people to invite him in and learn more stories about this distant homeland. According to one eyewitness, quote, "If we asked him to eat with us, he would eat whatever we had on the table. But after the meal, he began to talk. Now don't eat this food. It is poison for you. The people in your own country do not eat it." What an awful guest. Like, you invite him in for food and he eats it all and then just straight up tells you it's poison. Anyway, news began to spread about this man telling stories about his homeland, and this eventually grew into informal meetings where Fard Muhammad would teach about the homeland of Mecca and how they could improve their health and their standing in society by living more like their ancestors. This actually ends up evolving into Fard being sort of seen as a savior or a prophet who has come to America to restore African Americans back to their true faith and roots. And he would preach in a way that was likened to a Southern Baptist preacher, and even used the Bible as his textbook early on, because that's what most of his audience was familiar with. However, as Fard's influence grew, he actually began to get more extreme. He began to denounce white people and denounce the Bible itself, but this didn't actually stop the group from growing. In fact, it only got bigger. Attendance grew so much that Fard had to have multiple meetings with different groups over the course of the week, and this led to the members contributing enough money to fund a hall to act as a sort of temple for these meetings. This hall became known as the Allah Temple of Islam, and would eventually grow in Fard's time to about 8,000 members. So Fard's teachings weren't all about attacking white people in the Bible, they were also about uplifting the black community, so stuff like eating right, becoming entrepreneurs, raising families. But as the Allah Temple of Islam became more and more popular, the teachings of Fard only got more and more extreme, which we'll get into, I promise. It's important to note a lot of the Nation of Islam's teachings come from Fard Muhammad, teaching about his homeland of Mecca. So a lot of it comes from this sort of belief that African Americans should become more like ancient Arabians. I don't want to spoil all of the beliefs yet, but this did include giving the members new Muslim names as part of their initiation, teaching that white people were literally devils, calling for white people to be sacrificed to return to Mecca, and in general taking on this sort of really twisted teaching of the Quran. It was all about Fard Muhammad restoring African Americans to their true faith and calling. Whilst the temple would grow, it would not be until 1932 until the temple's extreme nature would really get mainstream notoriety for the first time, due to being heavily associated with a human sacrifice by one of its members. The story goes that on the 20th of November 1932, a prominent member of the Temple of Islam, Robert Kareem, had a roommate named John J. Smith that was seeking to be inducted as a member. Kareem invited Smith, along with an audience of about 12 people, plus Kareem's wife and children, to his home, where he had erected a homemade sacrificial altar. Smith believed that this was part of his initiation, and Kareem managed to convince him that if he presented himself as a human sacrifice for Islam, he would become the savior of the world. Smith nodded and presented himself on the altar, at which point Kareem stabbed him in the heart and bludgeoned his skull with an axle rod until he died, all in front of an audience of 12 plus Kareem's family. Kareem would be arrested and stating during questioning, "I had to kill somebody, I could not forsake my gods," eventually being declared legally insane. Fard Muhammad and fellow Temple of Islam leader Ugan Ali would also be arrested after a short manhunt. Reportedly, when the Detroit Police Department asked who he was, Fard Muhammad replied, "I am the supreme ruler of the universe." Both men would be put in padded cells and straitjackets. In the end, facing legal charges, Ugan Ali promised to disband the Allah Temple of Islam forever, whilst Fard Muhammad was put on a train for Chicago, forced to leave Detroit forever. The whole event would lead to the press giving the Nation of Islam the moniker the Voodoo cult. Fard would return to Detroit within a month to continue secret meetings, but would again be arrested and ordered to leave the city. This was not the end of Fard's teachings though, not by a long shot. Fard Muhammad would re-establish the Allah Temple of Islam in Chicago under a new name, the Nation of Islam. Membership would continue to grow as Fard developed the movement. He would publish 2 manuals on his beliefs, formalize the bureaucratic nature of the nation, continue to rent out halls for speaking, created schools called Universities of Islam for teaching their beliefs to the youth, and even created a paramilitary wing called the Fruit of Islam. It was around this time that Fard Muhammad's successor, Elijah Muhammad, would become Fard's second-in-command in Chicago and the leader of the remaining movement in Detroit. In 1934, Fard would disappear, supposedly being deported to Mexico, and Elijah Muhammad would take over leadership of the entire organization, with Fard never being seen again to this day. During Elijah Muhammad's leadership, the beliefs of the Nation of Islam would continue to develop by deifying Fard Muhammad as actually being the last incarnation of Allah or God, with Elijah Muhammad being his prophet, and that Fard would essentially bring a day of reckoning for white people upon his return. This deification even led to the creation of Saviour's Day, a holiday for the Nation of Islam, on Fard Muhammad's alleged birthday that is celebrated to this day. Over most of the next decade, Elijah would continue to spread the Nation of Islam by establishing a headquarters in Chicago and 2 more temples, one in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and one in Washington, D.C. Elijah would mainly be traveling out of state to establish other churches to get away from the leadership struggle that was happening at home. But in 1942, Elijah Muhammad would return to Chicago to preach, and this would be the beginning of the Nation of Islam coming to the attention of the FBI. FBI informants reported that Elijah Muhammad was sharing pro-Japanese sentiment at these meetings and encouraging his followers to avoid registering for the draft for the Second World War. This would lead to Elijah and some of his followers being imprisoned from 1942 to 1946 for draft evasion. Whilst the nation's membership would stagnate outside of prison, inside of prison Elijah would continue to preach and spread the message. After being released, Elijah went to work on rebuilding the membership that was lost during his time in prison, when in late 1948, he would receive a letter from a man named Malcolm Little. Elijah's message had such a strong impact on Malcolm Little that during his time in prison, he would rename himself Malcolm X. Malcolm X would be released from prison in 1952, at which point he travelled to officially join the Nation of Islam, which he would quickly rise through the ranks of. Throughout the 1950s, the Nation of Islam's membership would grow rapidly, aided by the civil rights movement and Malcolm X's charisma, with many more temples being established across the country. This expansion would lead to the FBI encouraging a media campaign against the nation, but this would actually backfire by helping spread the Nation of Islam's message, and their recruitment would grow in the following years. In 1960, Malcolm X would help found the Nation of Islam's first official newspaper, Muhammad Speaks. As you can imagine, it's full of very bizarre propaganda articles, advertisements for products and events. A ton of it is archived on JSTOR, so if you're interested in learning about when Saviour's Day is, or the genocidal morning after pill, or school uniforms designed by Elijah Muhammad himself, give it a look. I promise it doesn't disappoint. In the 60s, the relationship between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X would begin to fracture as a number of controversies would occur with Elijah Muhammad. In 1961, Elijah would meet with the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan to purchase farmland in the South, and in 1962 would invite George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, to speak at the celebration of Saviour's Day. Basically, at the end of the day, the Nation of Islam and some white supremacist organizations realized that they both wanted white and black people to be separated. Throughout the 1960s, Elijah would personally receive funds from Texas oil baron H.L. Hunt for his support of black separatism. On the 27th of April 1962, the Nation of Islam would reach national headlines when the LAPD would raid one of their temples. Outside of Temple number 27 in Los Angeles, 2 LAPD officers would get into a confrontation with a number of temple members, which quickly turned violent, as the officers would begin beating the members for seemingly no reason. A large amount of the temple's members would pour out into the street, at which point things would escalate further as the LAPD called for backup. Over 70 members of the LAPD would then violently raid the temple, leading to 7 members of the temple being shot, one of which became paralyzed and one of which would die. In response to the event, Malcolm X called for the Nation of Islam to take violent revenge with Elijah Muhammad's approval, but this was actually denied, beginning a rift between the two. Malcolm would continue to promote the Nation of Islam, becoming their first national representative, and even working to set up a branch in Britain, but this did not stop his relationship with Elijah from falling apart. In 1963, Elijah Muhammad would confirm that, like most cult leaders, he was having sex with young ladies from his cult. That same year, November, following the JFK assassination, Malcolm X would be reprimanded and banned from public speaking by Elijah Muhammad himself, after Malcolm essentially said that JFK deserved what was coming to him. This was also likely done to stop Malcolm X's profile from rising too much, as Malcolm's popularity had begun to eclipse Elijah Muhammad and even the Nation of Islam himself, leading to Muhammad seeing him as a threat to his leadership. In 1964, Malcolm X would leave the Nation of Islam after returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca, in which he learnt that the Nation of Islam's beliefs were extremely different to those of actual Sunni Muslims, prompting Malcolm to create his own organization, Muslim Mosque Inc. Also, very small side note, but in 1964, Cassius Clay would join the Nation of Islam, becoming known as Muhammad Ali. He would later go on to denounce the organization, but small side note worth mentioning. Things would continue to get worse from 1964 to 1965, as Malcolm X revealed that the young members that Elijah Muhammad was having affairs with may have been significantly younger than first thought. During the investigations, Malcolm X would publicly share that Elijah Muhammad had slept with 8 underage members, impregnating 7 of them. This video was originally just going to be about Yakub. I did not realize it was going to get so dark, but I guess we are talking about really crazy cult leaders. So, yeah. Anyway, on to an assassination. In early 1965, shortly before a prepared speech in New York City, Malcolm X would be shot as 3 members of the Nation of Islam would rush the stage with a sawed-off shotgun and 2 automatic handguns. Malcolm would be pronounced dead shortly before reaching the hospital with 21 gunshot wounds. 5 days later, at the Nation of Islam's Saviour Day event, Elijah would give a speech denying any official involvement in the shooting. But he would also say, quote, "Malcolm got just what he preached." The whole assassination situation would massively hurt the reputation of the Nation of Islam, with recruitment massively declining over the rest of the 60s, coinciding with the end of the civil rights movement itself. In 1965, Elijah Muhammad would write and publish Message to the Black Man in America, which was basically a manifesto for all of the Nation of Islam's beliefs. Again, I'm going to be covering all those beliefs in the later part of the video, but I will just spoil you a little bit and tell you that it details the life of Yakub, an evil god scientist who is part of an original tribe from the moon who was so evil that he would create white people. That's all I'm going to spoil right now. You'll have to wait. By the early 1970s, the Nation of Islam would have a temple or study group in every single state in America, but would continue to be marred by controversy and violence. In 1972, 2 officers of the New York Police Department would respond to a fake emergency call that led them to the Nation of Islam's Harlem Mosque. After attempting to enter, they'd be forced out by approximately 15 to 20 men, prompting them to call for backup. With 4 officers, they would again attempt to enter the mosque, at which point they would be attacked by the men, being beaten as they attempted to strip them of their guns. In the brawl, one of the officers would be shot, prompting one of the other officers to return fire, at which point the brawl would dissipate. After more reinforcements arrived, the NYPD attempted a proper raid of the mosque, making several arrests, but eventually an angry mob would form, and the NYPD would be forced to leave the area. The officer that was shot in the brawl would die 6 days later. Violence and controversy would continue to surround the Nation of Islam when, in 1973, the Nation of Islam would be strongly criticized by the leader of the Muslim Hanafi movement, Hamas Abdul Khalis. Khalis had originally been a member of the Nation of Islam, but split from the organization in 1958 over beliefs, and he would go on to serve as the mentor of Malcolm X when he also left the Nation of Islam. Khalis wrote 50 letters, one to each minister of every mosque in the United States, telling them that Elijah Muhammad was guilty of fooling people, robbing them of their money, and dooming them to hell, encouraging the Nation of Islam's members and leaders to leave the organization. This greatly offended many members of the Nation of Islam, and unfortunately for Khalis, the Nation of Islam had friends in very dark places. In response, 7 members of the Nation of Islam's affiliated Black Mafia travelled to the Hanafi movement headquarters under the guise of wanting to purchase literature. The 7 men would enter the headquarters and massacre Khalis's family. The Black Mafia members would shoot to death 2 men and a boy, and would also drown 4 children from the ages of 10 years old to only 9 days old. The only survivors were Khalis's wife, who was forced to watch the drownings before being shot and left in a vegetative state, and Khalis's daughter, who was also shot but survived with severe brain damage and trauma to the point that she could not testify in court. These murders would later serve as one of the catalysts for the 1977 Hanafi siege in Washington, D.C., led by Khalis himself. Again, I did not intend for this video to get this dark. It gets funnier. We'll get to Yakub. Whilst the Nation of Islam was heavily marred by these controversies and was losing favour in the black community, it was still a massive movement in the 1970s. It had schools, banks, farmland, its own newspaper and printing plant, and a number of businesses including barbers, restaurants, nightclubs, and even grocery stores. In 1972, Elijah Muhammad estimated that the Nation of Islam had a net worth of over 75 million USD, which, accounting for inflation today, is about $564 million. On the 25th of February 1975, Elijah Muhammad would naturally pass away, and the Nation of Islam would be headed by his son, Warith Muhammad, who would actually attempt to reform the Nation of Islam from 1975 to 1977. Warith disbanded the Fruit of Islam, which was the paramilitary wing. He ended the nation's dress code, changed the flag, decentralized power, stopped promoting that white people were devils, and introduced more actual Islamic concepts, all generally in an attempt to align the Nation of Islam more closely with the Islamic branch of Sunni Islam. This would cause a major schism within the Nation of Islam, with Warith Muhammad officially disbanding the organization and going on to form the American Society of Muslims. But not everyone accepted these reforms. This leads us to the Nation of Islam's current leader, Louis Farrakhan. Louis had joined the Nation of Islam in 1955 and had been a major player within the organization, becoming minister of the Harlem Temple, and in 1967 becoming a national representative of Elijah Muhammad himself. Shortly after Warith disbanded the Nation of Islam in 1977, Farrakhan and other members, frustrated with the reforms, began to rebuild the organization under the new name Final Call. In particular, Farrakhan really didn't like the idea of embracing parts of Warith's philosophy, mainly to do with not calling white people devils, or even trying to work with white people to solve the issues in the black community. Farrakhan and his followers, who referred to Warith's leadership of the Nation of Islam as the Fall, went to work re-establishing central parts of the Nation of Islam, such as the Fruit of Islam, and also created a new newspaper called the Final Call, which continues to be in production to this day. It's even got a website. Here's a 2021 article about the CIA and the truth behind UFOs and the Nation of Islam. It's great stuff. Anyway, in 1981, Farrakhan officially renamed Final Call back to the Nation of Islam, and it was from this point that the Nation of Islam somehow got increasingly more mainstream and also more bizarre. In 1981, Farrakhan would reveal that he experienced a vision back in 1985 in which he was abducted by a UFO and spoke to the now dead Elijah Muhammad. In the vision, Muhammad spoke in cryptic sentences and warned Farrakhan that President Ronald Reagan was planning to go to war, which Farrakhan believes was a warning about the 1986 bombing of Libya by the United States. Throughout the 80s and 90s more broadly, the Nation of Islam would begin to show its influence in the mainstream through rap and hip-hop artists such as Public Enemy and the Wu-Tang Clan. This is an influence that lasts to this very day, with many prominent rap artists referencing, praising, or even outright proclaiming membership of the Nation of Islam. This includes people such as Ice Cube, Snoop Dogg, and Rick Ross. In fact, Rick Ross literally has a song named Master Fard Muhammad that came out recently. On the 16th of October 1995, the Nation of Islam would organize their biggest event ever, the Million Man March of Washington, D.C. The event involved a range of civil rights organizations and leaders, and it was led by Louis Farrakhan himself, who was the keynote speaker for the event. The event was specifically aimed at uniting and uplifting black men, and has been followed up by the Million More March on the 10th anniversary and the Justice or Else March on the 20th anniversary. Aside from a small amount of controversy over the actual attendee numbers, which has been estimated to be as low as 400,000, the Million Man March has actually largely been viewed positively. Unfortunately, this has sort of been used to sanitize the public's view about the Nation of Islam, and has also helped Louis Farrakhan rub his shoulders in the political sphere, albeit with very little influence. For example, here's him with a pre-president Barack Obama at a black caucus in 2005. Sometime in the late 1990s, Farrakhan would reportedly be introduced to the beliefs of the Church of Scientology through Isaac Hayes, because, of course, this group needed an influence from Scientology. In 2010, Louis Farrakhan would begin to openly embrace the Scientology method of Dianetics and the technique of auditing. Dianetics is basically a set of beliefs that was a precursor to Scientology, and is based on a theory around your conscious and subconscious mind, and auditing is basically letting go of your subconscious mind. The Nation of Islam has since embraced Dianetics wholeheartedly and has its own Dianetics course in which members are encouraged to get audited. So all of that history leaves us with today, where the Nation of Islam is generally seen as this strange, fringe, black empowerment, but actually black supremacist, conspiracy theory, cultish sort of religious movement. They continue to get their message out by selling DVDs of Louis Farrakhan's sermons, and as I said earlier, they have a paper and an online newspaper. They also sell books, such as The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and the Jews, published in 1991. They're even using social media, such as TikToks and Reels, to promote their beliefs. For example, look at this guy, Riza Islam. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. This guy's name is Riza Islam. Here he is in Kendrick's Not Like Us music video. Anyway, it's estimated that today the Nation of Islam has anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 members across the United States. I've given you sprinkles throughout the video, but we're finally here, the part where I tell you about their beliefs. Very important to note, obviously, the Nation of Islam has never been accepted as an actual branch of Islam. Mainstream Islam generally views the Nation of Islam as a form of heresy or blasphemy. We should probably start with the story of Yakub. That's generally what everyone knows the Nation of Islam for. 76 trillion years ago, in the nothingness of space, a god willed himself into existence. This god then took 6 trillion years to form himself into a black man based on the nothingness he saw around him. He created the sun and then the planets, and then he created 23 other black men to create a council of 24 god scientists who would each take turn being in power. These god scientists could also see the future and prophesized about it, and they recorded their knowledge of the future in a book known as the Mother Book. And humanity has been given pieces of the Mother Book that we know today as the Gospel, the Torah, and the Quran. So like I said earlier in the video, the Nation of Islam's beliefs are really strongly based on this sort of fascination with ancient Arabia and the holy city of Mecca. And a big part of this fascination is with Arabic contributions to mathematics and astronomy. Hence why all of their gods are scientists, and also hence why there's a lot of really weird sci-fi stuff. So trillions of years pass, and on Earth there are 13 tribes of humans. One of the god scientists becomes so mad that these tribes don't speak the same language, and in his anger he uses literal explosives to blow up the Earth, which then creates the moon, and kills 12 of the tribes. Only one of the tribes survives, the tribe of Shabazz, from which the black race would descend. By the way, the definition of the black race in the Nation of Islam is a little bit different from what people generally use. It just means all people of color. It's also very broad. Elijah Muhammad has said that Eastern Europeans count as black. And I'm not joking, even Albanians. Albanians are welcomed to the Nation of Islam. The tribe of Shabazz would create society on Earth over the next 66 trillion years. But 1/3 of this society would end up dissatisfied with how things were going. From this third, about 6,600 years ago, a man named Yakub would be born. By the way, you've probably noticed that there's all these very specific numbers. The Nation of Islam also believes in numerology, so they believe that numbers have hidden meanings. Elijah Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan both have 14 letters in them. Because Yakub was born 6,600 years ago, and the number 6 represents white people, 666, the number of the beast, it all ties in. At the age of 6, Yakub, whilst playing with magnets, told his uncle, quote, "Uncle, when I get to be an old man, I'm going to make a people who shall rule you." In school, Yakub was known as Big Head Scientist for his massive cranium, which is never really touched on. In some interpretations, this is because he has 2 brains, but in the Message to the Black Man of America, where I'm getting this from, it doesn't give any explanation at all. He simply has a big head. Anyway, long story short, Yakub finds out by researching germs that within every single person, there is a brown gene and a black gene. And from this, he asserts that if you breed out the black gene in a process known as grafting or bleaching, you could create white people, who he could then use to rule black people. Yakub would eventually gather a very specific following of 5,999 people, along with himself to make 60,000, of course, and they would travel to the island of Patmos, Greece. On that island, he would begin an evil eugenics program focused around grafting and around killing off black babies in the goal of creating white people. Yakub would unfortunately pass away at the ripe old age of 150, but after 600 years, his eugenics program would be successful in creating the first white people, who would then rule the earth for 6,000 years. As you could probably gather from the first god being black and the whole gene thing, white people are basically considered demons, and Yakub is basically the equivalent of Satan or Shaitan. Also, according to the Nation of Islam, some of these white people were unhappy and tried to graft themselves back into being a black person. And apparently this is where we get monkeys and apes and all sorts of primates from, so that's neat. I mentioned before that the Nation of Islam believed that their founder, Fard Muhammad, is the latest reincarnation of Allah. What I haven't mentioned yet is that because Fard Muhammad went missing, they have a very interesting theory on what he's been up to. The Nation of Islam believes that Fard Muhammad is currently on a spaceship or a UFO called the Mother Plane that is watching over the Earth. One day in a day of reckoning, all the righteous people will be transported on the Mother Plane, at which point a bunch of, quote, baby planes will come from the Mother Plane and bomb the planet, basically removing all white people in a day of reckoning. They believe the planet will be uninhabitable for another 1,000 years until Allah, Fard Muhammad, will return to the earth and will create a utopia free of white people. Elijah Muhammad is also said to have not just died, but actually joined Fard Muhammad up in the Mother Plane in the sky, which is why Louis Farrakhan in 1985 had that vision about him. Honestly, it just reads like really racist fanfic. So going further into their beliefs, as you can imagine, in the Nation of Islam, most bad things in the world are attributed to white people. Some of the funnier ones are vaccines. All of them are secretly a eugenics program. AIDS, white people created AIDS. They also created processed foods like biscuits and white bread to poison black people. White people also apparently invented dinosaurs to undermine the Nation of Islam's beliefs somehow. Space exploration, as you could assume, is an attempt to either take down the Mother Plane or to escape Earth and escape judgment. Just to add to the bizarre beliefs, Tainetta Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad's wife, wrote articles for the Final Call until 2015, which, among other things, floated the idea that some of the 13 tribes may have survived the God Scientist explosion by hiding inside the Hollow Earth. Of course, Hollow Earth is somehow also tied into this. And just to end this list of bizarre beliefs, Elijah Muhammad also had a bunch of strange dietary advice that he reportedly took from Fard Muhammad. Obviously, no pork or bacon, but you should also avoid beef, lamb, or camel. And in regards to fowl, you should only eat baby pigeon. You also can't eat peas, sweet potatoes, lima beans, collard greens, turnips, or generally any food that has a white colour. He also stated in the interest of health that you should only eat one meal a day. But if you stretched this and only ate one meal every 3 days, you will never get sick and might even live to 1,000 years old. So yeah, even their beliefs about what you should eat are bizarre. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope that wrapped up all of their weird beliefs in a nice, succinct manner. Hopefully you understand the Yakub memes and the backstory of probably one of the weirdest religions / cults ever. Thank you so much for watching this video and listening to me ramble. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like and share it with one of Yakub's creations who you think would enjoy the video. But yeah, sincerely, thank you so much for watching the video. I hope it was good. See ya.